If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey there, crime fans. I am Alexis Knight, your no-nonsense guide through the twisted world of true crime, where every story leaves us wondering, what is the real truth? Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion, where we dive deep into the cases that have left us all scratching our heads and debating endlessly. Here, we don't just look at the crime. We explore those blurred lines, the messy details, and the public debates that never seem to end. Today we're talking murder or self-defense, where we explore cases shrouded in doubt and controversy. Was it an act of cold-blooded murder, or was it a desperate fight to survive? In this episode, we unravel the perplexing case of Melvin Roberts and Julia Phillips. Melvin was a well-known lawyer found strangled in his driveway, and Julia, his girlfriend, was found nearby claiming she was attacked by an unknown assailant. But soon, the police began to suspect that Julia knew more than she was letting on. So, was Julia Phillips a victim of a violent crime? Or was she the mastermind behind a sinister plot? Well, buckle up, guys, and join me as we navigate the facts, dissect the evidence, and dive into the courtroom drama. Was it murder or was it self-defense? You decide. Imagine a quiet town in South Carolina where everyone knows everyone and secrets are hard to keep. York is the kind of place where your neighbors, they know your business, and a crime like murder is almost unheard of. Now, on the surface, it seems like an idyllic community. We have seen those, but beneath the calm exterior, tensions and hidden conflicts can brew, and we've seen that too. In the middle of this close-knit town, though, stood a respected figure, Melvin Roberts, a seasoned attorney and former mayoral candidate, and a man known for his sharp mind and unyielding spirit. But on a cold February evening in 2010, that spirit was brutally silenced. Melvin was found in his own driveway, strangled with a zip tie, his body lying just a few feet from his parked car. Beside him was his longtime girlfriend, Julia Phillips, tied up with duct tape, bruised, and claiming to be the victim of a violent assault by an unknown assailant. She told police that a masked man had attacked them, rendering her unconscious while killing Melvin. But as the investigation began, Julia's story started to unravel. So Julia Phillips, she was no stranger to the people of York. At 61 years old, she had been a familiar face in the community for years. A woman of average means, kind to those who knew her, and a dedicated partner to Melvin for nearly a decade. But as the spotlight shifted to her in the wake of the murder, many did begin to wonder, was Julia the innocent person here, the terrified woman she claimed to be? Or was there a darker side to her story? And we ask ourselves this when we hear about crimes often, right? We need to know more. And it was no different for the locals here. The town was divided. To some, Julia seemed every bit the victim she portrayed, a woman who had suffered an unimaginable trauma. But to others, she appeared strangely calm and composed in the days following the murder. And then there were the whispers of conflict between Melvin and Julia. We always hear about those. There were rumors that he had been planning to break things off, that their relationship was fraught with tension. Did Julia fear losing Melvin? Was she afraid of losing the financial stability and social standing that came with their relationship? Well, the police were quick to suspect Julia, especially when inconsistencies began to surface in her account of that night. But was this really a case of cold-blooded murder? Could it be that Julia Phillips, a woman with no history of violence, had orchestrated a brutal killing? Or was she, in fact, an innocent woman caught up in a nightmare, a victim of circumstance rather than a criminal mastermind? And so we ask, was Julia Phillips a grieving partner who survived an attack that left her lover dead? Or was she the architect of an elaborate murder masked by a carefully crafted story of self-defense? Was this a crime driven by passion or fear or desperation? Or was this something far more sinister? As we peel back the layers of this case, we need to consider the possibilities. These are the questions, and we are going to explore the events that led up to Melvin Roberts' death, the clues left behind, and the questions that remain unanswered. You get to decide here for yourself. Was it murder, or was this self-defense? All right, let's head to York, South Carolina, where all of this is taking place. It's a small, unassuming town where everyone knows each other's business. Nestled in the rolling hills of the Palmetto State, it's the kind of place where church gatherings, community events, and Sunday dinners define the social calendar. The people of York, they were accustomed to routine, to the familiar faces they saw in their everyday lives, and to a sense of safety in their community. So when the news of Melvin Roberts' death spread, it hit like a shock wave. Melvin was a figure who commanded respect. As a former city councilman and a lawyer with a reputation for being tough but fair, he had a lot of friends and tons of admirers. But he also had his share of enemies, people who found his outspoken nature abrasive or his legal dealings questionable. Still, no one could have predicted such a violent end to his life. The idea that someone had brought violence to this quiet southern town, let alone to a man like Melvin Roberts, it was nearly impossible for many to accept. Julia Phillips, meanwhile, was known as Melvin's long-term partner, a woman who had seemed dedicated and supportive through all their years together. Yet the very night of his death, she was at the scene, tied up and bruised, claiming to have been attacked. Could she have been a victim of a crime herself? Or is it that she's trying to hide something far more disturbing? Let's continue. Okay, on February 4th in 2010, Melvin Roberts began his day much like any other. At 79 years old, he was still active in his legal practice, and he spent most of his mornings in his office at the courthouse in York, South Carolina. Now that day, he had several meetings scheduled and planned to return home by the late afternoon. Melvin had been involved in a few contentious cases lately, but to those who saw him that day, he appeared calm and confident, like usual. Julia Roberts, his girlfriend of nearly a decade, had spent the morning running errands around town, and by all accounts, it seemed like an ordinary day for both of them. Julia visited the grocery store, chatted with neighbors, and returned home to prepare for the evening. She and Melvin had plans to have a quiet dinner together, something they often did on weeknights. As dusk fell, the two spoke briefly on the phone to confirm their plans, and Melvin mentioned he would be home shortly. So, around 7 p.m., Melvin drove up to his house. It's located in a quiet suburban neighborhood. According to Julia, she stepped outside to greet him as he got out of his car. But what happened next is where this story takes its dark turn. Julia would later tell police that as Melvin was walking toward her, This masked man appeared out of nowhere, attacking Melvin from behind. She claimed the attacker then knocked her to the ground, tied her wrists with duct tape, and left her lying in the grass while he strangled Melvin with a zip tie. Julia said she lost consciousness at some point and woke up only to find Melvin dead and the attacker was gone. When the police arrived, they found a scene of chaos and confusion. Melvin's body lay on the driveway, his face contorted in a grimace, with a single, tightly wound zip tie around his neck. He had several bruises and cuts, and there were signs that he had struggled fiercely against this attacker. And just a few feet away, Julia was found lying on the ground, her hands loosely bound with duct tape, and her face covered in superficial bruises. Julia appeared dazed and frightened, repeatedly telling officers that she had been attacked and had no idea who the assailant was or why they would want to kill Melvin. She described the attacker as a large man who had a deep voice. He was dressed in dark clothing and he was wearing a mask. She claimed that the man had shouted something unintelligible before assaulting them, but she could not remember any further details. At first glance, Julia's story seemed plausible. There was visible damage to Melvin's body, consistent with a violent struggle, and Julia bore signs of an attack as well. But as investigators began to examine the scene a little bit more closely, doubts began to form. So let's take a look at why there are doubts. What were the inconsistencies in Julia's account? Well, for one, as the police questioned Julia about the events, they noted several inconsistencies in her story. At first, she says and stated that she had been unconscious for most of the attack, unable to provide a clear description of the assailant. But then later, she starts to offer up more details, describing the attacker's build, his voice, and even his supposed demand for money. Her changing story raised suspicion. Why had Julia not mentioned these details earlier? I mean, was she simply in shock? Or was she struggling to keep her story straight under pressure? Now, also, there was lack of physical evidence of this supposed intruder overall. Despite Julia's claims of this unknown assailant, the crime scene offered little evidence to support the presence of a third party. There were no footprints leading away from the scene. There was no discarded weapon they could find, no signs of forced entry into the property. The driveway and surrounding area were pretty much undisturbed, and there were no indications of a hasty escape. Investigators were puzzled. I mean, how could someone have committed such a violent crime without leaving a trace? Was Julia telling the truth, or was she trying to cover up her own involvement? This is where these questions begin. Also, the duct tape used to bind Julia's wrists that was examined very closely, and forensic experts noted that it was loosely applied. And it appeared that Julia could have really freed herself if she wanted to. And this raised the question if she had bound herself, just to make it look like she had been attacked. And then the zip tie, the one used to strangle Melvin, this was another crucial piece of evidence. Investigators discovered that the zip tie matched a type commonly used, and it was found in Julia's home, specifically in her gardening supplies. There were also traces of Julia's DNA on the zip tie, suggesting that she handled it at some point. However, Julia's defenders argued that this was all circumstantial. After all, she and Melvin lived together, and her DNA could easily have transferred onto many household items. And this is true, right? Sometimes something looks a certain way and it turns out to be totally different. So investigators they still have questions. It still is confusing. So let's look at the possible motive here, the relationship between Melvin and Julia. What is the motive? I mean, as the investigation progressed, details emerged about this relationship they were having. Friends and acquaintances of the couple described it as strained in recent years, with frequent arguments, and there was tension growing. Some reported that Melvin had spoken about even ending the relationship, stating that he felt unhappy and a little bit trapped. Could Julia have feared losing Melvin? He did provide the financial support, and he gave her a place in the community. The prosecution would later argue that Julia saw the end of the relationship and it was a threat to her and her stability, and she decided to take drastic action, and that is what happened. Julia's behavior and actions after the crime, they were also being looked at. Officers on the scene noted that Julia's behavior seemed somewhat unusual for someone who had just witnessed a violent murder. While she appeared dazed and disoriented, she was also oddly composed and coherent when speaking with the police. In the days following the crime, Julia's demeanor continued to raise questions. Witnesses reported that she seemed unusually calm and at times even appeared to be more focused on practical matters like arranging Melvin's funeral and dealing with his estate. All of those things more than grieving his loss. Now, although Julia was the primary suspect at this point, the police did look into other potential leads. They considered whether Melvin, as a lawyer, might have made enemies who would want him dead. They also explored the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. However, none of these avenues produced any solid evidence, and the investigation repeatedly circled back to Julia Phillips. And based on these findings, the police felt that they had enough evidence to arrest Julia Phillips and charge her with the murder of Melvin. Now, before I go any further, how do you guys out there feel about that? Would you be convinced that she had killed her husband? And I know this is a short version of an actual crime, but as we watch true crime all the time, what would your opinion be if we had to cut it off right here? We will continue, because that is what they do. They charge her for the murder of Melvin Roberts, and her arrest shocked the community, and it divided public opinion sharply. Many of Julia's friends and supporters, they stood by her, insisting she could never commit such a crime. While there were others who felt that something was just off about her story and the way she conducted herself after Melvin's death. Well, Julia's trial date was set, and as the date approached, the central question loomed larger than ever. Was she a cold-blooded killer who meticulously planned this murder? Or was she a frightened woman caught up in an unimaginable situation? When Julia Phillips went to trial, the courtroom became this battleground for two vastly different narratives. And we've seen this happen many times. The prosecution painted Julia as a calculating murderer, while the defense fought to prove that she was an innocent victim of a violent crime. So let's get into both sides of this argument and understand what's at stake. The prosecution, led by Assistant DA Kevin Brackett, presented Julia Phillips as a woman driven by fear, jealousy, and desperation. They contended that she killed Melvin Roberts in a premeditated act to prevent him from ending their relationship and cutting off her financial support. The prosecution highlighted testimonies from friends and neighbors and Melvin's acquaintances, who testified that Melvin had been unhappy in his relationship with Julia. They argued that Melvin had confided in several people that he planned to break things off with her, and soon. The prosecution suggested that Julia feared being abandoned and feared losing her status and her financial stability, prompting her to hatch a plan to kill Melvin. Now, Julia had been financially dependent on Melvin for several years. We see this happen, and prosecutors argued that Julia stood to lose a significant amount if Melvin ended this relationship. And with this potential loss looming, they argued that Julia saw no other way out but to remove Melvin from the picture entirely. The prosecution leaned heavily on forensic evidence, particularly the DNA traces found on that zip tie used to strangle Melvin. Experts testified that the DNA could only have been deposited through direct contact, and since the zip tie matched those found in Julia's home, it strongly suggested she was involved in his death. The prosecution pointed out that the duct tape used to bind Julia's wrists, that it was so loosely applied, and she could have easily freed herself. They argued that she bound herself to stage a false narrative of a violent assault, and so she could create an alibi. Additionally, Julia's story changed, first claiming she was unconscious for most of the attack, and then later providing all those details. Julia's varying account of the crime scene became a focal point. In her initial police interview, she described being unconscious during most of this attack. So how is it that later she recounts details such as the sound of the attacker's voice and his demand for money? And therefore, prosecutors argue that these inconsistencies show that Julia was trying to fabricate a story under pressure, unable to keep the details straight. And they also highlighted her reaction to this crime, noting that Julia didn't appear as frantic or distressed as one would expect from a person who had just survived in a violent attack themselves. Her demeanor in the days following Melvin's death, it was calm and controlled, and it raised further suspicion. And then there was the zip tie. It's such an unusual weapon at this time for this crime, one that requires close contact, and would have been challenging for an unknown assailant to use this without leaving any other significant evidence or DNA on the scene. Prosecutors suggested that Julia chose the zip tie deliberately, knowing that it was readily available at her home and easy to dispose of or explain. Furthermore, the zip tie matched those found among Julia's gardening supplies, making it unlikely that a random attacker would have chosen the same type. The prosecution argued that this was not a coincidence, but rather proof of premeditation. They also pointed to Julia's behavior immediately after the crime. So she was reported to be unusually composed, as I said, and witnesses were talking about how she was just focused on practical matters, like I mentioned, the funeral arrangements and financial issues, worried about all of that, but less sad that Melvin was actually gone. And so this, they argued, was not the behavior of a traumatized victim, but was the behavior of someone who was methodically covering their tracks. And then we had the defense, led by attorney Melissa Friedman. Well, she presented a radically different picture of Julia Phillips, portraying her as a woman who had suffered a traumatic and violent attack. Her team argued that the prosecution's case was based on assumptions, circumstantial evidence, and an inherent bias against Julia from the beginning. The defense argued that the prosecution's theory of a financial motive was flawed. While it was true that Julia depended on Melvin for financial support, there was no clear evidence that she felt threatened by their relationship status. In fact, friends testified that Julia had expressed concerns about Melvin's health and well-being and had never mentioned any fear of a breakup. The defense also emphasized that Julia had zero prior history of any violence or criminal behavior. There was no indication that she had ever been aggressive toward Melvin or anyone else, suggesting that the notion of her committing such a brutal act was totally far-fetched. The defense also took aim at the forensic evidence, particularly that DNA on the zip tie. They argued that DNA could have been transferred, and in many ways, especially since Julia and Melvin lived together. The defense posited that the mere presence of her DNA did not prove that she used the zip tie to kill him. Regarding the duct tape, the defense argued that Julia had been in shock, trying to free herself from bindings, which could explain why the tape appeared loose. They also questioned the prosecution's handling of the forensic evidence, suggesting that potential contamination and human error could have influenced the results. Julia's defense team presented medical experts as well who testified that her injuries, though not severe, they were consistent with an attack and could indicate that she had been struck and briefly knocked unconscious. They argued that her shock and confusion explained her inconsistent statements to the police. They even called upon psychologists to testify that victims of violent crimes often exhibit symptoms of shock and trauma and confusion, and that can make their accounts seem contradictory or fragmented. They contended that Julia's shifting statements were typical of a trauma survivor, and that's not evidence of guilt. The team also argued that the police had focused way too narrowly on Julia and had not adequately investigated other potential suspects. They suggested that Melvin, being a prominent lawyer, could have made enemies over the years, and any of them might have wanted him dead. The defense accused the police of failing to consider other theories, such as robbery gone wrong or revenge by an adversary. And they pointed out that the absence of other suspects was not proof of Julia's guilt, but rather evidence of a flawed investigation. The defense made it clear that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. They argued there was no smoking gun tying Julia directly to the crime, no clear motive beyond speculation, and no confession or eyewitnesses. They emphasized the principle of reasonable doubt, arguing that without concrete proof, the jury could not convict Julia Phillips of this murder. They asked the jury to consider the possibility that Julia was indeed a victim of a violent attack, that she had lost the man she loved and now faced the additional injustice of being wrongly accused. All right, let's take a check, guys. Was there an unknown assailant? Was there? What about the interpretation of the forensic evidence? And then, what do you think of Julia's behavior after this crime? As we continue, we will explore the controversy surrounding this trial, the media frenzy that ensued, and the broader public debate about what really happened that night. Was Julia Phillips a cold-blooded killer or a wronged woman fighting to prove her innocence? Let's continue. The trial of Julia Phillips was not just a courtroom battle here. This was a story that captivated the public, and it sparked heated debates in living rooms, cafes, and online forums across the country. And that's what this podcast is about: public opinion. This case was filled with twists, conflicting evidence, and compelling characters, making it a perfect recipe for controversy, of course. But what exactly kept this case in the spotlight, and why do people continue to argue about it to this day? Because they do. One of the central points of contention in this case is the question of motive. The prosecution argued that Julia Phillips had a strong motive: fear of losing Melvin Roberts and the financial support he provided. But many who followed the case felt that this motive was just not strong enough to explain such a brutal crime. Some argued that while Julia might have felt insecure about her relationship, there really was little concrete evidence that she became desperate enough to kill. To many, it seemed implausible that a woman with no history of violence or any criminal behavior would suddenly resort to murder over the potential end of a relationship. Now, on the other hand, those who sided with the prosecution, they argued that people have committed crimes for far less. And yeah, we know that to be true. And they pointed out that emotional stress combined with financial insecurity, it could push anyone to a breaking point, especially in an intimate, strained relationship. Forensic evidence often provides clarity in criminal cases, but in the trial of Julia Phillips, it only seemed to muddy the waters further. The DNA, this caused a debate all on its own. This DNA found on the zip tie, it was presented by the prosecution as damning evidence of Julia's involvement. However, the defense argued that this evidence was circumstantial and could be explained by everyday contact. both can seem to make sense here. And Julia lived with Melvin, so that causes a problem right there. Many forensic experts weighed in on both sides, with some arguing that DNA evidence was compelling and others suggesting it was far from conclusive. And the public was left to wonder, could this DNA prove Julia's guilt or not? Is it just another layer of ambiguity? There were also debates about how the forensic evidence was even handled. The defense raised concerns about potential contamination or the mishandling of evidence, and some independent forensic experts suggested that the procedures used by the investigators, they were not foolproof. And these questions led to even further doubts among those who were following this case. And then we have the media, right? They shape public opinion as well. And their shaping of public opinion here, it was substantial. From the moment Julia Phillips was arrested, the local and national news media covered every development, often painting Julia in starkly different lights. There were the sensational headlines and narratives, right? Some media outlets portrayed Julia as this black widow, a term used to describe women who kill their partners, while others depicted her as a victim of a rushed investigation and a biased judicial system. The use of loaded language and dramatic headlines created polarized perceptions of Julia in the public mind, and it influenced how people viewed this case long before a verdict was reached. What do we feel about that? I mean, the public was inundated with competing narratives, from true crime documentaries suggesting that Julia was innocent, to opinion pieces that labeled her as a cunning murderer. This dual narrative created a split in public opinion. Some believed she was wrongly accused, while others thought she was certainly guilty. The case also brought to the forefront issues relating to gender and societal expectations. Julia's betrayal in the media and courtrooms became this flashpoint for broader discussions on how women accused of violent crimes are perceived. And many argued that Julia was unfairly labeled based on gender stereotypes. The narrative of the jealous, dependent woman who kills when faced with losing her partner, it all fit neatly into a stereotype that has been used historically to discredit women in courtrooms. And it works a lot of the time. Critics argued that these stereotypes did influence not only the prosecution's portrayal, but also the public's perception of Julia. But on the flip side, there were others that felt that Julia's gender played a role in garnering unwarranted sympathy. And they argued that if a man had been in Julia's position, the public would have been far less likely to even consider him innocent or to suggest that he was a victim of circumstance. Now, in York, South Carolina, this case became a local sensation. And of course it did. The small town atmosphere meant that almost everyone could have an opinion on Julia Phillips' guilt or innocence, and they all wanted to talk about it. Many of Julia's neighbors and friends, they rallied to her defense, organizing support groups and even setting up a fund to help cover her legal costs. To them, Julia was familiar and friendly, someone who was being unjustly accused. And the others felt that, she's hiding something, and they pointed to her odd behavior after the crime and all those inconsistencies in her statements. This trial had a deep impact on the community, polarizing the residents. Now, beyond the specifics of this case, Julia Phillips' trial touched on broader questions about the justice system and the handling of cases where evidence is like this, mostly circumstantial. These kinds of cases make our heads spin. This case reignited debates over whether people should be convicted at all when it's primarily on circumstantial evidence. Legal experts were divided. Some argued that the cumulative weight of the evidence against Julia was just overwhelming. But then there's always people on the other side that feel like the evidence falls short of proving guilt. Questions were raised about whether Julia received a fair trial. Did the media coverage bias the jury? Were there implicit biases in the investigation or the prosecution? Many argued that the answer to these questions might not be as clear-cut as we would hope. When the jury delivered its verdict, it did little to resolve the public debate. Julia Phillips was found guilty, but many continued to question whether justice had truly been served. Was this woman a cold-blooded murderer, or was she a victim? Even after her conviction, Julia maintained her innocence, filing appeals and continuing to proclaim that she had been wrongly accused, and to this day, the case remains a topic of heated debate, with supporters still on both sides. So even after all these years, the public seems to be in the same place, as well as many in the legal community, and that should tell us something. These cases are difficult, and it's very hard for us as human beings to commit to one side or the other, and certainly too hard for us to agree. In this episode, we've explored the intricate details of a case that has puzzled, polarized, and provoked intense debate, both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. Was Julia Phillips a cold-blooded killer, carefully plotting to eliminate her partner to protect her own interests? Or was she a victim herself, swept up in a tragic series of events beyond her control? Think back to the forensic evidence, the DNA on the zip tie, the duct tape that bound her wrists. Does it point to a guilty hand? Or is it simply an innocent victim's contact with everyday items in her own home? Consider, though, the inconsistencies in her story. Were they the result of a desperate attempt to cover up a crime? Or were they the confused, fragmented recollections of a trauma survivor? And what about that motive? Was fear of losing financial security and social standing enough to drive Julia Phillips to murder? Or did the prosecution overreach in its portrayal of her emotional state and intent? Can we believe that someone with no prior history of violence would suddenly resort to such a brutal act? Or does this theory fit into a deeper pattern that we have seen before, where the woman is labeled as the jealous partner, regardless of the true complexities of her story? Look closely at the role of the media, the public perception. This case is far from really settled, even after the jury's verdict. Many still believe that Julia is innocent, while others just believe in her guilt. So where do you stand? Was she a master manipulator, guys? Because she could be. Was she a victim of circumstance beyond her control? This could be true. Was Melvin's death a cold-blooded murder, or was it a tragic act of self-defense gone wrong? All of these are possibilities. Just think to yourself, though, if the right decision was made. It's so easy for us to think about it and walk away, but what if you were Julia? What if you were innocent? It's so hard to know when we're on the outside of the courtroom, outside of the crime. When we are not the suspect or victim, sometimes we just don't get to know the final truth. Until next time, guys, keep questioning, keep searching for the truth, and remember, the most challenging cases often live not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. You've been listening to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.